Learn all about the exciting new features coming with React 19, including baked-in ways to handle actions, optimistic updates, form statuses, the new Use API, and more. You'll also learn about the new open-source compiler that automates performance optimizations behind the scenes. Bob Zarol from Scrimba developed this course. Join him to explore these cutting-edge updates and more, ensuring you're fully equipped to leverage the latest advancements in React development.
Hi there, and welcome to this mini crash course on everything that's new in React 19. At the time of recording, React 19 is in release candidate status, which means that it is very close to becoming the new major version of React. And so I thought it would be really helpful to go through some of the new features that are coming in React 19, both new APIs that are being introduced, as well as general improvements to the React library and the React ecosystem in general. In this course, we're going to be starting actually with something that came with React 18 called useTransition and the concept of transitions in general. And there's actually two reasons we're going to start with that. First of all, if you've taken my introductory or advanced courses in React, you'll know that we don't cover useTransition in either of those courses. And so this is an opportunity for me to teach that topic. But secondly, the idea of transitions is going to be crucial in understanding the new actions that are coming with React 19. However, before we get to actions, we are going to very quickly talk about the new compiler that's coming with React. This is a really exciting way that will simplify some of the performance optimizations that we used to have to make manually with React. After that quick lesson, we will jump in and talk extensively about this new concept of actions, which is a great new paradigm in React that allows us to handle mutations in our data in a slightly different way. Actions will help us segue into the new hooks that are being introduced in React 19. We'll see a really quick update to how we can pass refs to custom components. We'll take a look at the new Use API, and we'll top it off with a number of other miscellaneous improvements that are coming to React. My name is Bob Zarol. I'm generally responsible for the React curriculum on Scrimba. These days I am most active on X online, so if you wanted to give me a follow, you can click my screen name there and it will take you to my profile. And without further ado, let's jump right in. We'll start learning about what's new in React 19 after we play a little bit of catch-up learning about transitions. One of the headliner features in React 19 is a topic called actions. However, in order to understand actions, it's important that you have a solid grasp on the concept of transitions in React. Now, you may already be familiar with transitions. If that's the case, you are welcome to skip the scrim. In my other React courses, which I teach on Scrimba, I don't yet cover the concept of transitions. And so for those that have taken my other courses, this is a way to sort of catch up on the concept of transitions before we talk about actions. Now, the example that I have here is only a slightly modified version from what you can find in the useTransition documentation on the React Docs website. So if you've seen that, then this should look kind of familiar. This would be a good time if you want to just peruse around the code and see if you can make sense of it, but I'm just going to give a quick high-level overview of what's going on here. Inside of our app component, we're maintaining some state. This is kind of like mimicking a React router scenario where we're displaying something different depending on which tab is currently selected. We have these three buttons here, which essentially just set the state of the tab. There's also some styles happening, so we know which one is currently active. And then down here, we are conditionally displaying different elements depending on which tab is set in the state. If the tab is selected as products, then we, instead of rendering an H1, we render this products component. So let's come down to the products component. This product component will iterate over an array of products. These products are coming from data.ts. This is using a library called faker.js to create an array of 1,500 fake products. And so it iterates over that. And for each one of those 1,500 products, it renders a slow product component. The slow product component has a little artificial slowdown for 1 millisecond. So if we're rendering 1,500 of them, it will slow down for 1,500 milliseconds or 1.5 seconds. And we can see this in action if we click on the Products tab. I'm going to click it right now. And that took about 1.5 seconds for this to finally show up on the page. The concept that we're talking about, transitions and the useTransition hook, it's not going to fix that problem of it taking a long time for products to show up. However, there is a bit of a bad user experience that happens if we try to click products and then click to another tab. Let me go back to home. I'm going to click products right now and then about right now. And let me do that a little bit faster. So we'll click products, then about. Okay, so products never loaded, but it did wait before it shifted me over to the About page. This is something that I do all the time. When I'm browsing the web, I click something and then realize, oh, actually I wanted to click this other thing instead. The way React is working under the hood, and this is the important part to understand, when I click products, React adds the changing of the state that's happening right here when I'm setting the tab to products, and it puts it in a queue of state changes. And it's going to go through and process that queue one at a time from top to bottom. There's a bunch of other things that are happening regarding concurrent mode and state change batching and whatnot. But if you think of it this way, it will help make sense of useTransition. When you click products, it adds this set tab to products at the top of this queue. And then when you click About immediately afterwards, it puts that in the queue as well below the changing to products. As such, React is going to prioritize switching to products first, and then it will switch to About afterwards. And because products is a really slow component to load, we get this experience where we click products, About, and it takes 1.5 seconds before it eventually just switches immediately to About, and the whole switching to products just looks like it never really happened. This scrim has gotten a bit long already. I want you to take time to look through this code, make sure that you understand it, and in the next scrim, we'll talk about how we can solve this using useTransition. Let's see how we can use transitions to improve the user experience that we have with this tab switching issue that we're facing. Again, what's happening when I click products and then click About immediately is React is queuing up those two state changes to happen back to back. And first it tackles changing the state to products. However, changing our tab to products also includes rendering our products array, which has 1,500 slow products in it. And so that state change takes a while to complete. Once it has completed that, it immediately starts tackling changing the state to About, which takes almost no time at all. And so we get this phenomenon where we click products, then About, and it takes a while before it just immediately switches to About. The idea of transitions is it allows us to teach React that certain state changes are interruptible. In other words, if I tell React that calling setTab should be interruptible, in effect telling it that it's a lower priority state change, instead of queuing up a switch from home to products and then queuing behind that a switch to About, when I click products and then immediately click About, React will say, well, I can stop doing what I'm doing. I don't need to complete switching to products before I switch to About because this state change is discardable or interruptible. It's a lower priority state change. Let's see the syntax for implementing that. It's really simple, and then we'll see how it's working in action. In order to set up a transition, we will use the useTransition hook. This again was introduced in React 18. We haven't yet gotten to the new React 19 features. And at the top level of our component, we will call our useTransition hook. useTransition, similar to useState, will return an array which has two items in it. The first one we will call isPending. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second one is called startTransition. StartTransition is a function, and we'll go ahead and call that startTransition function. This is a lot of functions, but it takes a callback function as its argument, and whatever state changes we make inside of this callback function will be marked as a lower priority or an interruptible state change. So I moved my setTab just inside of my startTransition callback function here. This is essentially all we needed to do to mark this as a lower priority state change. Okay, moment of truth. I'll click products, then About. Perfect. It has discarded the state change to products because it realized that there was a more important state change happening, and that was the state change to About. As such, React was able to just discard the entire rendering of our lengthy and slow products component in favor of switching to About. And in the end, our user experience is better than it was. Okay, let's talk about this isPending variable. This is the beginning of where we start seeing that React is providing some really interesting things for us to use. The isPending value that we get here is something that React gives us so that we can, in our code, provide some immediate user feedback as to what's happening behind the scenes. Because notice, even when I click products, there still is no user feedback in the 1.5 seconds that it's taking for the products page to render. And if you've ever handled something like this before, you're probably very familiar with the idea of having to manage this yourself and saying something like loading and set loading is equal to a call to use state and probably initialized as false. And then when you switch tab, you would set the loading to true. And when it's all done, you would set the loading to false, and maybe you handle errors. And I guess that would probably happen right here. And this kind of boilerplate just is so common that React built it right into the value of isPending, which is a Boolean value as to whether or not the transition is still happening. Now, your imagination is the limit as to how you can use isPending to make your user experience so much better. I'm just going to do a really quick thing down here where on top of rendering these 3 different things, I'm going to say isPending and just a paragraph that says loading. And there might be a better way to do this, but just so that I'm not also showing these if the isPending is happening, I'm just going to add not isPending on top of here so that it's only rendering either the pending state or one of these items. Okay, let's refresh. I click About, I click Home, and if I click Products, we'll see we get a loading state before all the products finally load. This is a much better user experience. Now, I could do the same thing with my setting of styles so that when I click products, notice when I click it, nothing happens to the button. I could set up another style that says if isPending is true, then change the style of the button to some sort of pending state, showing the user that they did successfully click this button. Again, the sky's the limit for what you can do. So this is really nice that React is handling this for us. Hopefully this gives you a good reminder of what the useTransition hook does, or if this is your first time, hopefully that makes sense because now we're primed to start discussing the new topic of actions that was introduced in React 19. One of the biggest features that was just announced with React 19 is a brand new compiler. This compiler that was just released in beta is an evolution of something from a number of years ago that was called React Forget. And essentially what this compiler can do is understand your code ahead of time and translate it into code that is more performant and bypasses some of the limitations with React that we used to have to handle manually. If you've taken my advanced React course here on Scrimba, you do have to be a pro member to access that course. I have an entire section all about performance. It goes into use memo, react.memo, use callback, and as it turns out, with the compiler, we are not going to need those things anymore. The compiler can take your code, understand where the potential performance drawbacks are, and it can automatically handle those use cases. So at least how it's being billed at the current time, we just will no longer need to really understand or use react.memo, react.useMemo, or react.useCallback. At the time of recording, the compiler documentation was just released a day ago, so you can click the screenshot here to go over to the compiler docs. And as you see, it's still under construction, so it's very possible this will have changed by the time you get there. Not only that, but the compiler was open sourced, and so there's a lot of really exciting things happening with the compiler behind the scenes in the open source community, so it's certainly possible that things will change soon. In these docs, you can see how you can get it all set up, so if you wanted to play with it, click the screenshot here to go to the docs and learn how to get set up. As of now, that's pretty much all there is to say about the compiler, so now we're ready to move on to the next main headline feature of React 19, and that is actions. Another main headline feature of React 19 is a topic called actions, and the concept of actions have been around in the web for a very long time. Essentially what we're touching on here is anytime you want to make what's called a mutation to your data. When you're interacting with data from, say, a database, usually you can divide these interactions with that data into 2 categories. One being loading or getting that data to display to your users, and another being to mutate or change that data so that it can be updated in the database. Actions touch on that second category of making mutations. In the React docs, they say that by convention, any functions that use async transitions are called actions. Personally, I think this definition is a bit more confusing than it might be helpful, although once you understand the concept of transitions, as we talked about with useTransition, it starts to make a little more sense. But essentially, this boils down to giving you the ability to make data mutations in a native React way. And we're going to see 2 ways in which that's the case. The first and maybe most straightforward way that we now have using actions in React 19 is to provide the action prop to the form element. In the HTML spec, the form element is allowed to take an action prop, and you might already be familiar with this if you've been developing for the web for a while. Typically, the action prop is set to a string. The idea being that when a user submits a form, it will send that data to the endpoint or to the route of that string, where the code will then handle the form submission, validation, and everything like that. In React 19, you now can pass a function to the action prop in a similar way that we passed an onSubmit handler to handle form submissions previously in React. This is what we'll be looking at first, but really quick, another built-in way to handle a lot of common use cases with actions is to use a new hook called useActionState. This gives us some additional tools that can make these common use cases a lot simpler, but we're going to get to that in just a minute. If you happen to have taken my React router course here on Scrimba, you might remember a scrim where I specifically go in to talk about how forms in React are just really challenging to work with. They've been a pain point in React since essentially the beginning of React. And in my personal opinion, this direction of using the action prop and passing a function to it is quite a bit simpler. So let's actually take a look at that. Let me walk through the basics of this code first, and then we'll see how we can simplify it using this new form action. In typical fashion with React, we tend to control the components of our inputs. This means that instead of allowing the form to maintain its own information and its own state, kind of like forms were built to do from the beginning of the web, we use React to maintain that information instead. So we're tracking the input text for our input field, and that means that on every keystroke of this input field, we update state. We're calling this handle change function, and it's updating our state right here so that React can then display that state as the current value of this form. Something has always felt a little off to me about this, and I'm sure that there are great reasons for this, but personally it feels a bit more convoluted than it needs to be. Then our form has an onSubmit handler. It prevents the default from happening because if you remember, the default is for that data to be sent to another page, which requires some kind of navigation event on your form. In JavaScript, if we don't include this, then you might already know this, but the page will just completely reset and our JavaScript won't continue to run when it's trying to process the information from the form. So we add this prevent default, and in this case we have this fake function that sends the input value from the form over to our database. It takes a bit of time for that to finish, and then if it's successful, we take the new name that comes back from this function call to our database and we set it in state. That's what gets displayed here in this blue text. We reset our input back to an empty input, and in this case we're just console logging any errors that might happen along the way. If you've been writing React for a while, you might already be very used to this, but with form actions, there's now a better way. New to React 19, and you might already be familiar with this concept if you've used Next.js, is we can now provide an action prop. So I'm replacing this onSubmit with a prop called action, and we can pass to it a function. This function will need to change a little bit though. Since action is not an event handler like onSubmit was, we're not receiving the event as the parameter, but instead we're receiving the information from the form. I'll call it form data. Of course, we can call it whatever we want. And this form data object is the native web form data object. You could go to the MDN docs right now, search for form data, and you would find the object with its properties right there. This is awesome because it means I have access to all of the information from the form without me having to track it in local React state. Technically speaking, I did have access to this with the event where I could grab the event.target, which was the form, and I could use that to get all the information from the form as well. But this way is a bit more native and a lot more intuitive. Now that we've changed the signature for our handle submit, there's a number of other changes that I need to make. First of all, I can get rid of event.preventDefault because I don't want to prevent the default anymore, or rather that's being handled for me by React. Because I'm going to be grabbing the information from my form using this form data object, I no longer need to track my state. So I can get rid of my input state. Down on my actual input, I can get rid of this value and onChange properties. Awesome. And instead of passing in the input, because I'm not tracking that anymore, we're going to do this a slightly different way. In order to grab data from my form, I can call formData.get. Form data objects have a .get property, and this allows me to get information from my form based on the name attribute for the inputs in my form. Well, in my case, I don't have a name attribute, so let's go ahead and add a name attribute. And in this case, we're tracking a name or a username, so I guess it's name equals name in this case. To be clear, this part needs to be name, this part can be whatever you want. Maybe a name field was a confusing choice, but that's okay. So because the name of this input is the string name, I can use .get name, and this is how I can get access to the data from that form input. Let's look through the rest of this. New name should stay the same. I don't need to set input anymore, so I can get rid of that line of code. And as far as I can tell, we can probably rename this from handle submit to, I don't know, whatever we want, maybe form action, and we'll just change it down there, just to be clear that we're not doing a submit handler anymore. And our code is quite a bit simpler. Let's go ahead and hit save. Oh, and I can get rid of this whole handle change function because I'm not using it anymore. Okay, let's hit save again, and let's try typing in Bob's role. I'll hit enter, which will submit the form. A couple seconds later, it changes and updates exactly like it was before. I personally really like this direction that React is heading in, using the native form data object, using forms with their native capabilities of maintaining their own state, and accessing that state in the way that forms have been dealt with since the beginning of forms on the web. Okay, now this isn't the full picture. There are a number of other things that we would normally want to take care of manually, but since we've already covered a lot of ground in the scrim, feel free to play with the code as always, and when you're ready, we'll move on. We'll start talking about other benefits that come with React 19. At this point, we're really only handling the happiest path when it comes to submitting our form. In other words, we're assuming that the call to the database is going to work, and right now we are catching the error, but we're just displaying it in the console. Usually, we'd want to provide some information to the user about what went wrong. Also, we have no kind of pending or loading state happening on this form right now, so when I type in a new username and I hit enter right now, there's a lag of time that happens while it's speaking to the database before our current user is able to update, and we don't give any feedback to the user that submitting the form is actually doing something in the background. Historically, in React, this would mean that we would need some additional states, and so we would set up something like a loading and set loading. This would be with state, and maybe we'd initialize it as false. And then pretty imperatively or manually, we'd have to go to our action and say, okay, first we're going to set loading to true. And then at the end of our block here, we're going to set loading to false. And if we wanted to do the same thing with error states, we would need to track the error. And so we might have error and set error in state again. And maybe we'll start it as null, and I need my equals there, of course. Then at the beginning of our form action, we'd want to make sure that we reset any errors that might have happened from previous submissions that had errors. And here we might set the error to the error that comes back. Okay, and then normally with those new pieces of state, I would conditionally render some elements on the page, like a paragraph that says loading or a loading spinner, and probably a paragraph that says that an error has happened. In this case, because our form action is happening in a transition, I believe this doesn't actually work the way we think. But the point is that we had to do a lot of this manually. Because form actions run as a transition, if you remember, an action by convention is a function that uses async transitions. These updates for the state are considered low priority, and so inside of our action, we're actually not able to update the UI in the same way that we had done before with an event handler. Because updating state, both with whatever error we might be getting back and stuff like loading states is such a common use case, React has given us a new hook. And that new hook is this useActionState that we saw very briefly. If you want to learn more about the useActionState hook, you can click the little pi symbol down here in the bottom. That will take you to the documentation for it. Or you can stick around with us because in the next scrim, that's what we're going to be talking about. We'll be turning the common use cases that we see here and using the useActionState hook in order to get this functionality back. So that's what's coming up next. Let's see how we can use the useActionState hook to gain back some of the functionality that we want when it comes to maintaining state and loading errors and so forth inside of an async transition or an action. The useActionState hook gives us a way to track and change component state, a pending status that automatically gets flipped for us back and forth by React, and gives us a wrapped action function that we can use in our form as the function that we pass to the action prop. Although the truth is these action functions don't have to be used in forms, there are other ways that you can use them as well. We just so happen to be using them in a form as it's going to be one of the most common use cases for actions. So let's see exactly what this looks like. I'm going to get rid of these two state creations that I had before and everywhere that I'm changing them in my code. So that's here and here. We can just get rid of this finally altogether. And okay, we're back to where we were before. Let's go ahead and pull in the useActionState hook. And at the top of my function, I'm going to make a call to useActionState. And this is where the API for this hook differs a bit from what you might be used to. With useState, we know that we get a state value and we get a function to update that state. With useActionState, we actually get 3 values back. So I'm going to destructure the array that we get back. The first item is going to be the state that we want to maintain inside of our component. This is very similar to what we had before. The second is going to be the action function, and this action function we're going to provide in just a minute over here. But while I'm doing this, I'm going to make sure I update my form action to be this new wrapped action function that gets returned by calling useActionState. And in the case of this hook, there actually is a third value. Oftentimes in the documentation, this value is called isPending. Because we're destructuring an array, you could call this whatever you want. I think just to distinguish it between the loading that I had before, I'm going to stick with isPending. This represents a Boolean value, either true or false, that will automatically update for us depending on the current status of the form. If the form is submitted and things are happening in the background as part of the transition that React is performing, then it will update isPending to be true. And this gives us a chance to put that paragraph down in our return value where we can indicate that things are loading or do a loading spinner or whatever it is you want to use. Okay, that's going to be great. So in useActionState, I'm going to provide 2 values. The first value will be a function. We'll fill this out in just a second. And the second value is going to be my initial state. This reminds me a lot of the array reduce function, where we provided a function that allows us to alter the state, and as a second parameter, the initial state that it should start with the first time it runs. In our case, we do have some state that we care about in this component, and that is our name state here. So what I can do is just take the name state initial value that I gave it before, and I'll just paste it in right here. Let's put these on their own lines so they're a little bit more readable. Okay, now what do we do about this function? Well, this function is the action that we want to run when the form gets submitted, or again, whenever this action function gets run. So I want you to think for a second, is there anything that we already have in our component that we can use as the contents for this function? Well, we already wrote our form action function down here, and so I can either just take the name of that and put it right here, or if I really wanted to, I could take the contents of this function and just stuff it right in here in the useActionState. I think I'm just going to leave this here because we already wrote it out. Because I'm going to be using useActionState to maintain the state of my component, I shouldn't need this useState anymore, so we'll go ahead and clean that up. And currently the only thing I'm tracking is that name state, so I could maybe just choose to call this name so that I don't have to update everywhere else to say state, so we'll do that for now. This will be changing very soon. All right, at this point we have bitten off quite a big chunk of new information, and there is one more thing that we have to make sure we cover when it comes to useActionState, and that has to do with this form action function. However, because we're trying to process a lot of information here, we're going to do that in the next lesson instead. However, before just pushing ahead, if you feel confused at all about what's going on here, take the time to mess around with this code. Also, don't be afraid to go over to the useActionState documentation and just try to read a bit more about it. In fact, the funny thing about these slides, these links that you see will actually lead you to the What's New in React 19 blog post. And that's because when I recorded this, that blog post did represent the most updated API for these new hooks, whereas the actual documentation has not yet been updated to show the brand new APIs for them. So the documentation is not currently correct as I'm recording this, but that blog post is. So those links do lead you to the blog post, and hopefully you'll get some helpful information there. If you need to watch this again to help things sink in, that is completely okay. And in the next lesson, we'll tackle updating form action so that it will start working again the way that it was before, but this time with a few extra benefits. So once you're ready, we'll move on to that. If you're familiar with the concept of reducers in Redux or useReducer in React, you might already understand what we're about to talk about. The React team has chosen to make this action function that you pass as the first parameter to useActionState work in a similar way to useReducer. As things currently stand, this is not yet going to work, and that's because this function doesn't just take the form data as the parameter, but it also will receive the previous state for our component as its first parameter. And then the job of your form action function, assuming you want this state value, which we're calling name in this case, to be updated correctly, the job of your action function is to return the new version of state, whatever it should be. Before we were calling setName. In this case, we're going to return the new name. Notice that we're not making use of this prev state value. We're going to in just a minute. But by returning the new name, that means that React will take the return value from calling our form action function, and it will automatically update this name value for us and re-render the component so that anywhere we're referring to name, like down here, will be correctly displayed to the user. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. Let's go ahead and change this back to my name, Bob Zarol. I hit enter. It does still take a couple seconds and we don't yet have those pending values, but it updated correctly. Awesome. Okay, now that we're back in a working state, let's actually start improving the user experience here. And we're going to do this with a challenge. If you're already relatively experienced with React, then this might not be much of a challenge for you, but I want you to figure out how you can display a paragraph with this loading text. Of course, this is more of a placeholder for a much better designed loading spinner of some sort, but it should display this loading paragraph whenever the action that you're running is still in the process of running. I'm not going to get too much more detailed there because I think this is probably obvious enough. And if it's not, that's okay. It's a good time to play around with the code and look at the values that you have access to see if you can figure it out. And I guess let's go ahead and just put the paragraph right here. Pause now and work on this challenge. The key lies in this isPending value that we're getting back as the third item in this destructured array that we're getting back from useActionState. The cool thing about isPending is React is already going to handle flipping it from false to true and true to false for us behind the scenes. So I just already have free access to this isPending value. We'll go ahead and say if isPending is true, then let's go ahead and display this paragraph right here. Let's clean up the challenge text, hit save, and test this out. I'll hit enter. We get a loading value, which is awesome. That gives some kind of user feedback. And then when it's done, the loading value goes away. It flipped back to false, and the update finished. Okay, I want to do a bit of a sanity check here because we have covered a lot of ground. We have gotten rid of all manual state creation that we had before. We originally had the input, which tracked every keystroke of our input. We had the name that we were saving. We also at one point created state for the loading state and the error state. And we've since removed all of that. Instead of the input, we're letting the form track its own information just the way forms have always done in the past. For the state that does affect how this component displays, in this case just the name that's showing up in this blue text, useActionState gives us access to a state that we can update inside of the function that we pass to it, in this case called formAction. Actually, you know what? Now that I think about it, formAction and action function are confusing names for this lesson. Let's go ahead and have this say something like update name. This way, this function can focus on doing the one thing it's supposed to be doing, which is to update the name, and we're not going to get bogged down in the term of action function or form action and other equally confusing names. The state that we're getting back from useActionState is going to be determined by whatever we decide to return from our function, in this case, the update name function. Currently, we're only tracking the string name, but in a second, we're going to do this and include an error state as well. We're also getting the isPending value just for free by using useActionState. This allows us to avoid having to track that state by ourselves, and we're able to determine what the initial state would be. Just like in useState, we can say blah, blah, blah equals useState and then provide an initial value right here. We can essentially mimic that same thing in useActionState by providing this second parameter. If you don't care what the initial state is, you can just put null here. Okay, let's finally tackle the error state and see how we can provide feedback to the user when there's some kind of error when we're trying to update the name in the database or communicate with our server, whatever the error might be. The way we currently have this written, the state that we care about with our component, we are tracking just in this name value. It's just a string. However, if you've ever used Redux and dealt with reducers in Redux, or you've used useReducer, or if you've ever just tracked your state using an object instead of simple primitive values like strings or booleans, you might already be familiar with the idea of having your state that you're tracking in your component be an object rather than a simple primitive value. So instead of grabbing my initial state just from local storage and having it be a string, let's update this state so that it's an object instead. And actually, I'm going to make this a challenge. Okay, your challenge is to update the state that we're getting back from useActionState to be an object that will involve changing this initial state here. And that object should have a name property instead of just being a bare primitive string value. Then I'd like you to change this from saying name to saying state, and then update anywhere in your component that is currently referring to name to make it reference the correct thing so that things are still working exactly like they are now. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Most of this is straightforward. The one thing that might be tricky is right here on line 25. You'll need to make sure you don't forget to return the correct value of state inside of your update name function. Okay, I think that's enough information. Pause now and work on this challenge. All right, let's do this one by one. So instead of just having this be a bare value, I'm going to wrap this in curly braces and give it a name property, just like that. That should be everything we need there. Then personally, I think it makes more sense to call this state because it now represents the state of this component instead of just the bare name value. Down inside of my return, I have here referencing name, but now that's going to be state.name. And I guess that's the only change that needs to happen there. And then this one, instead of returning the string value for new name, I'm going to return an object with a name property just like that. This is one of those refactors that's not going to look like it really did much at all. We'll go ahead and put in a new username. We get our loading state, and cool, our name has updated and everything still seems to be working. Okay, Bob, now why did we go through all that trouble? Well, because we're tracking an object, we now can contain multiple pieces of state inside of this one state value. Whereas before, we needed to track the error in its own separate error state like this using useState. We now can track error information just inside the same state that we got back from useActionState. And again, this is where if you've ever used useReducer or reducers in Redux, it's going to feel pretty familiar. Let's go ahead and add to our state an error value. I'll start it off as null in this initial state. And because that's getting kind of long, let me put these on their own lines. Okay, great. Well, now we finally need to take this error message that we're catching inside of our catch block here and figure out a way to display that to the user. And that's actually going to be your next challenge. Okay, your challenge is to take the error message that is just currently being logged to the console right now and move it out into the UI so that the user gets meaningful feedback as to what went wrong. By the way, if you had a chance to look at the code for this update name in database, it's really not doing anything with the database. It's just waiting for 1500 milliseconds and then updating local storage with the name that was provided. I do have this little case in here, though, that says if anywhere in that new name there's the text error, then it will throw an error. So you can trigger the error by just typing in error. That's probably the easiest way, and hitting enter. Now, the trickiest part about this challenge is going to be using the previous state to make sure that you don't get rid of the name property that used to be there. It would be easy to just return an object that has an error property, but doing so would eliminate the state.name and you would get some weird undefined values. And then you'll want to display the error message. I put a little placeholder right here where you can do that. And I think that's all the information you need. Pause now and work on this challenge. Okay, let me just get rid of the console.error because that's not really very useful to our users. And instead, we'll go ahead and return an object. And that object should have an error property, which will be the value of the error object that we're catching in this .catch block. Because of the way JavaScript works, if I have the same property and variable name, I can actually just get rid of one of them. So I'll just say error. However, if I don't return the name property, then this state variable here will no longer have a state.name. And then we'll have something like state.name being undefined, and we just don't want that to happen. So I will make sure to include a name variable, and I'll just give it whatever the previous state's name property or value was. If you've used reducers or maintained state objects before, you might be saying, well, can't I just spread in all of the previous state and then overwrite the error? And yes, you can. In fact, this is the way that I prefer to write it. However, just for the sake of clarity, I think it's a little easier when you're learning this to see it written out this way. The last thing that I'm going to do, and I actually didn't mention this in the challenge text, was I want to reset my error to something like null when the user is trying to update their name in the database again. I don't want that message to stick around from before. I'm actually not 100% sure this is necessary. Let's go ahead and test it out. We'll keep it this way for now. Down here where I'm displaying the error, I'm going to say if state.error is truthy, or it exists, then I want to display a paragraph. And I did previously come up with a class name for this that's just called error. And I'll just stick in state.error.message. There might be an issue here. Let's clear out the challenge text and hit save. Let's try to submit error. We get loading. And perfect. Awesome. We get failed to update name. The name did not update, so that's good. We wouldn't want this to say error, as well as telling them that the name didn't update correctly. And just for curiosity's sake, let's go ahead and take this out like we were saying and see what happens if first I get an error and then I try to update it to Bob. Okay, well, for the most part, that seems to work just fine. I think it's maybe nice to be a bit more explicit and say we're setting the error back to null. But at this point, we're kind of splitting hairs. Now, we've talked for a long time, but in the end, all we really did was add this error state to the state that we're tracking from useActionState, and then update our UI and our logic a little bit. The only other update I might choose to make here, if you've noticed, if we had an error, we get our error state, that's great, but I'd kind of like to be able to click update and have that error disappear immediately. Right now, if I click update, it sticks around while it's talking to the database. I think the easiest way to fix that would just be to say, as long as we're not is pending and there is an error, then display the error message. This way, if pending is true, then that's just going to disappear. And I guess we can test this. We'll hit error so that we get our error state. We'll say Bob's role. There we go. Okay, the error message went away as soon as I submitted my form. Okay, wow, that was a lot of information on useActionState. However, that does represent a huge new addition to React 19, so it warrants spending a bit of extra time so that we really understand what's going on under the hood. There are a couple new awesome hooks that were included with React 19, and those will fit naturally into exactly what we're working on now, so that's what we're going to do next by talking about useOptimistic. It's really important as we're developing our applications that we handle any potential error states that might happen. However, if we were to really look at the stats at how often errors occur versus how often our interactions with our server and our database just kind of work the way that they're supposed to, I'm sure that we would find that a vast majority of those interactions with the server work out just fine. I guess if that's not the case for your app, then you have a couple other issues you might want to work out, especially with your backend developers. One of the things that we can do is optimistically update our user interface when we submit something or make a mutation with the assumption that things are going to just work out, and then if for some reason they don't work out, we revert it back to a previous state. Doing this makes a huge difference in the snappiness of your app. It can feel like it's truly happening natively, and some of that loading state stuff can really just be removed so that the user feels like the app is immediately responding to their inputs. For example, if I'm here and I type a new username and hit update, it would be ideal if the absolute instant that I click update, it just updates up here. And I don't need to worry about it loading or thinking about the round trip that's happening to the server. As a regular user, I just want it to update. And that's where the new useOptimistic hook comes in. useOptimistic has an API that's very similar to useState, and it provides an optimistic state that can update to the user immediately, and behind the scenes, it will automatically be reverted if there is some kind of problem that happens in the background. So let's see the syntax for useOptimistic. First, I need to make sure that I pull it in from React, so we'll get useOptimistic. And right below my useActionState, we'll go ahead and pull in the optimistic name and a set optimistic name. Again, this is very similar to the API for useState. but we'll call useOptimistic. And then the key difference here is instead of giving it kind of an initial value like anonymous user or whatever, we're going to pass to it the value that we're trying to have it track between renders. That will make a bit more sense to us in just a second. By doing this, we now have optimistic name, which we can display immediately to the user. Instead of displaying state.name, we'll go ahead and display the optimistic name. And then we also need to make use of setOptimisticName. And actually, that's going to be a challenge, just to make sure you're alert and awake and paying attention. Your challenge is to figure out where would you run the setOptimisticName so that it will update immediately when the user submits the form. In fact, you should place it where you think it should be and then test out the code and see if, ultimately, if it's working. As soon as you hit update, the name that's displayed should immediately update. And if you submit some kind of error, like Bob error, and hit update, it will display Bob error briefly, and then it will revert back to the name that it had before and display the error message. Time to get your hands on the keyboard, pause now, and work on this challenge. Well, it's this update name in DB function that is causing the delay that just is naturally happening as we're speaking to our server. So even before we do that, I'm going to call setOptimisticName, and we'll pass in the formData.getName like we're doing down here so that it can just optimistically set the name immediately before this await update in DB happens. And that should be all that I need to do. This setOptimistic is pretty powerful. We'll hit update. I'll change this to Bob and hit enter. And look at that, we have Bob immediately, and we did see that loading while the update name in database was still happening, but in the end, loading went away and we already saw what was happening. In fact, it almost feels like we really don't need that loading state anymore, but let's tackle that in a second. First of all, I'm going to submit an error. I'll hit enter. We see error up here, and then it reverts back to Bob, and it gives us some user feedback that says that it failed to update the name. This kind of optimistic update is something that you might not realize you're using everywhere, but it happens everywhere. For example, if you're on Twitter and you hit the little like button or the heart, you don't want a little loading spinner to show up while it's speaking to the database to see if it can correctly heart that tweet. Instead, you just want it to fill in the heart immediately and do all the other stuff behind the scenes. A vast majority of the time, it just works the way that it's supposed to. And so we can give our users that snappy experience by using this useOptimistic hook, and automatically by React get the ability to revert it back to what it was before if something does go wrong. Honestly, because the isPending value was only there to display loading while the interaction with the server was happening, and now we're using an optimistic update, I'm just going to get rid of that isPending value for now, and let's hit save and try this whole experience again. And there we go. Now there was a bit of a lag there where we're still seeing the text inside of our input. I'm sure that there's a way that we could update that, but for now I think the point has come across that useOptimistic is a really helpful tool whenever you want to add a bit more of a snappy responsive feeling to your application. There's one more brand new hook that we're going to tackle next, which is called useFormStatus. So that's what's coming up. Another new hook we have in React 19 is a pretty straightforward one, but can be really helpful if you ever find yourself building a component library that relies on forms. And of course, this hook is called useFormStatus. The main idea of useFormStatus is that when you have a form element, there's often a number of aspects with that form that can be really useful for your components to know about. And it's a fairly common task to build component libraries that have specially designed elements like a custom input or a custom button. And commonly you'll want those different elements to react to different states in your form, like this isPending variable. So first, let's go ahead and make a custom button. This is just an example. Of course, this could be as complex as you might want it to be. And in this myButton component, we are just going to render a native button, and we'll just put in the children there. And let me change button up here to myButton. Now this is about as basic as it gets, but there's a few things that we still need to do in order for this to be a drop-in replacement. For example, if we have a type or any other prop like style or class name, we would want to make sure to pass those on. So we can do that with a spread operator. We'll just pull in the rest of the props, and I'll go ahead and just spread those directly onto the button like this. And that way, if I had other props like type submit or like a class name that was associated with this button, those would just get passed down automatically. However, when it comes to different form states like the isPending variable, if you wanted your myButton component to react differently if isPending is true, historically you'd either have to pass this down as a prop. In this case, that's really not that big of a deal. You could say isPending is equal to the value of isPending, and then you would have to pull in isPending as a prop. I won't go too far down this hole because that's not the way we're going to do it. Or if this button were maybe multiple levels nested deeply into this form, you might decide instead of drilling those props multiple levels down, you would have to create your own context. Well, in order to help with this pretty common use case, React released this useFormStatus hook. And it couldn't be simpler to use. The main thing that it does is it acts as a context consumer for the nearest parent form element. So essentially, React turns the form element into a context provider, and useFormStatus is a way to consume that context. And it will automatically pass down information about the current status of that form for you. This couldn't be easier to use. The only thing that is a bit different is we're not going to import this from the React library. We're going to import it from the React DOM library. So we'll pull this in from React DOM. I think the reason for this is because they're turning the native form element into a context provider. That's something that needs to happen in the DOM and not just in the library of React. So now that we have that imported inside of my button, I can just consume that context. Let's go ahead and just see what comes in. I'll call this object equals useFormStatus, and that consumes the context that's passed down. And then we'll go ahead and console log this object so we can get a chance to see what it's all about. We can see that it's an object that has 4 properties: pending, data, method, and action. Let's go ahead and submit this form. And there we can temporarily see pending changed to true. Data was an instance of form data. The method, which is the request method for this form, was a get method. And that's just because I didn't specify on my form that it should be a post or anything like that. And then the action is the action function in case we needed to run that action inside of our button for some reason. I imagine of these properties, the pending property and the data property are probably the most useful. For example, I might be able to just pull in the pending status from useFormStatus. And I don't know, maybe we want to say if pending is true, then the button will display maybe submitting, but otherwise it'll display the regular children. It might be a contrived example, but let's go ahead and see how that works. And I need to not console log object anymore. Okay, so let's change this to something, and I'll hit enter. We can see it says submitting while it's submitting, and then it changes back to update. Again, this is pretty straightforward. It's really useful whenever you're building any kind of custom form component that needs access to the information about the current state of the form. This useFormStatus hook does represent the last of the brand new hooks from React 19, but it's not the last of the features from React 19. So we still have a little bit of ground to cover. As always, play around with the code as much as you want, and when you're ready, we'll move on. Since we just created this custom button that we're using inside of our form, I thought it would also make sense to talk about an improvement to refs in React. Really, what a ref is a way to maintain state between renders without triggering a re-render. Normal state in React will maintain state or maintain information from one render to the next, but anytime that state changes, it will rerun your components or re-render your components. That way, what gets displayed on the screen is a function of whatever your current state is. And a ref will essentially do the same thing, but it won't cause that re-render. Oftentimes, a ref is used as a way to hold on to the reference to a DOM node. If you ever need to imperatively interact with that DOM node, a really common example is setting focus inside of an input element, but doing it with the native DOM JavaScript using .focus. There's a lot of other reasons you might want to hold on to the DOM node of something, but if you are creating a custom component like my button here, and you're creating the ref in the parent component like we have in our form up here, we need a way to pass that ref down to our custom component, and we can do that with the dedicated ref prop. And so we set ref equal to the ref that gets created up above. I didn't bother to actually create this ref using the useRef hook because that's a little bit outside the scope of this lesson. But in order for this to work, we can't simply pass it down as a prop in React 18 and earlier. Instead, we had to use a built-in function called forward ref. And this is something that was sort of meant to be a workaround for a temporary solution to this issue of forwarding refs. And using forward ref would provide the ref as a second property or a second parameter to our component. So this destructured object here represents props, but there would be a second one called ref. And that way I could pass that ref onto the button and just give it to it like that. As I said, this was meant to be a temporary workaround on the React team, and so fortunately with React 19, we don't have to do it this way anymore. We can pass refs as a prop just as you might normally expect to do so. This part would stay exactly the same, where ref equals ref, and then it would show up as one of the props. So we have props.children, and we would have props.ref, and then all the rest that we pulled in. So not a giant change, but it is really nice to minimize the API of React when you can by getting rid of that forward ref function. You don't need to do that anymore. And again, this really only is something that you'll do if you're making custom components. Oftentimes when you're building a component library and you need to be able to give access to the ref on the native DOM element that you're rendering in your component. So nice and concise, pretty simple, straightforward, using refs as a prop. That's one of the new features in React 19. One of the most exciting things that's been added to React 19 has been talked about quite a bit over the last couple of years. It's an API that they've been working on for quite some time, and it's called use. Now, this is actually separate from what we were talking about with new hooks because use isn't actually a hook. In the documentation, they simply call it a new API. And now I know what you're thinking, the name is really confusing. There's a lot of debate about the name itself, but try to keep in mind that it's not actually a hook, and therefore it doesn't have to obey the rules of hooks. One of the most prominent rules of hooks is that they cannot be used conditionally. They have to be used at the top level of a component, and you can't put a hook call like useState inside of an if block, which I personally haven't run into too many issues with, but I know that it is a bit of a headache for some use cases. And what use does is it allows us to read some asynchronous resources, and then it will automatically suspend the component. This is using React suspense. We're going to see in just a second how we can implement that. And then kind of randomly, use can also be used to consume context, essentially like a drop-in replacement for use context anytime you've had to pull in and consume the context from a context provider. However, because of point number one, you now can replace use context with use, and you could conditionally pull in that context if you needed to. Now let's work on point number two here, where it can read async resources. When React very first started talking about the upcoming release for version 19, a lot of people were talking about how you can take your fetch requests, for example, and pull them into your component and write your code as if it were synchronous. I'm going to give a bit of a spoiler alert here. We're not able to do that with the actual React 19 as it currently stands at the time of this recording, but I'll show you what I'm talking about first, and then we'll see what the actual limitation is. Fetching resources inside of a component has always been a bit of a rigmarole when it comes to doing it natively in React. There are some really great and popular libraries like TanStack Query and SWR that make this process quite a bit simpler, but in vanilla pure React, the way that we have typically had to do it is by using a use effect to run the fetch request when the component first mounts, and then to save that information in state. That would look something like this. We'll import useState and useEffect from React, and we'll go ahead and set up our useEffect, and I'll put a dependency array that's empty so that it just runs the first time. Before we write the code there, let's go ahead and save this information in state. We'll call it Pokemon because we're going to pull from the Pokemon API and set Pokemon. And we'll get that with state. We'll just initialize it as null. And then inside of my use effect, we will make our fetch request. So I can call fetch, and I'll just put in the URL that I already have copied. We'll tack on a .then and get the JSON from it, or rather parse the JSON from it. And then we will take that data and we will set the Pokemon to that data. Presuming you've done a bit of React, this hopefully looks pretty familiar, or at least makes quite a bit of sense just from seeing it. I'm not going to worry too much about what I actually do with this data, so I'm actually just going to run json.stringify, and we'll stringify the Pokemon, and I'm just going to do a little bit of formatting to it here. Okay, great. Well, that information comes in and it's working, but essentially what we're having to do here is use an effect because this component we know is doing something asynchronous. It's going to render, and we need it to have something that it can render, and then it's going to run an effect, and we know that effect is going to take some time, or that fetch request is going to take some time. Then when it finally comes back, it's going to set the data in state so that it re-renders the component now with a Pokemon object the way that we would expect, and displays it down here below. We really have to be thinking a lot about the asynchronous nature of these components and understand the rendering cycle and how everything's working under the hood. Use, let's go ahead and just pull it in right now. Use is intended to make this process a lot simpler. In React 18, they introduced the idea of suspending a component, and that allows us to create a declarative boundary or a suspense boundary around the component that we're rendering and give it a fallback or a loading UI of some sort that when the inner component suspends, the suspense boundary will display on the screen while things are still happening under the hood. First, let's make use of use and see how that benefits our code, and then we'll need to make use of the suspense boundary right after that. Use is really nice. I don't need a use effect anymore, so I just have my fetch, and I won't need to save this information in state. So I have my fetch here. Let's go ahead and save the promise that comes back from fetch as, let's say, fetch promise. Just have to spell it right here. There we go. If you weren't familiar, fetch returns a promise, and all the .then chains also return a promise. And I don't know that it's okay for me to make a component that starts with await like this, so I can't just await the response from that fetch. But I have this fetch promise, and I can call use from React and get the data what looks like synchronously. So I'll say Pokemon equals use, and then I will pass in my promise that I want to wait for it to resolve before I display anything. And actually, I can get rid of this .then because we're not doing set Pokemon anymore. Already, this is so much easier to understand. I can write my code as if everything were going to happen synchronously, and I can more declaratively use a suspense boundary to suspend everything. First of all, let's go ahead and, well, let's just see what happens. Okay, so I get an error. It says that async await is not yet supported in client components. And honestly, this is a bit cryptic. Essentially, what's happening is my component with use has suspended, but I'm not catching that with a suspense boundary in any way. So let's do that. We'll go ahead and pull in the suspense component from React. And this is the only place we're rendering things, so I'm just going to wrap this in the suspense boundary like this. Okay, and then I can provide a fallback prop to suspense. We'll just set it equal to a paragraph that says loading. Of course, this is where you'd want to put some kind of skeleton UI or maybe a loading spinner or something like that. Okay, let's see what happens. I'm going to hit save, and look at that. We get our data back in. However, we do get a warning from React. The warning says a component was suspended by an uncached promise. Creating promises inside the client component or hook is not yet supported except via a suspense-compatible library or framework. And yes, this leads us to the main limitation that we currently have with use, and that is if we create a new promise inside of the code of our component, then the problem is every single time this component re-renders, it's going to create another promise. It's going to make another fetch request. And so we either need to create a mechanism that will cache this promise and make sure that it doesn't perform another fetch request when the component re-renders, or like it says, we need to use a suspense-compatible library or framework that will do that work for us. In fact, we can go see that note directly here in the documentation, and it just, well, gives you the exact same warning that we just saw. There is a way around this where we can create our own cached promises. However, that is a bit outside the scope of this lesson. I think that use shows, pun intended, great promise for the future, especially when React implements something that makes caching of promises a lot easier. Like they say down here, in the future, we plan to ship features to make it easier to cache promises inside of render. And by the way, inside of render just means inside the body of your component. In fact, if you wanted to play with this code, this would be a good time to do that. You can see how this fetch request is happening again and again every time this component re-renders, and you could just create a simple Boolean state or a counter state or something, and a button that when you click it, it flips that or increments or whatever, anything to change the state of this component. You'll see that this loading state right here, this fallback loading state, happens again and again and again every single time the state changes because it's making another fetch request. In fact, I'm pretty sure you could go to your network tab and see that happening as well. At this point, that's about as far as I'm going to go into the new use function that we have access to. Hopefully in the future, we'll find that it's much more, I guess you could say, useful for us. And with that under our belts, that really does represent the majority of what I wanted to talk about in this course. However, there are a number of miscellaneous improvements that don't necessarily require me to give you code examples, but that I think would be important to go over. So we're really rounding the end of this mini course, but I want to make sure I touch on these miscellaneous improvements that are coming with React as well. Besides just all the new stuff that came with React 19, there's a bunch of miscellaneous improvements that they made to the React itself. And I'm not going to go into every single one of these because honestly, you can just go to see the blog. It'll show you exactly in detail every single thing. I am going to focus on the ones that I think are easy to demonstrate, especially here in the Scrimba environment. And the first one I wanted to show off, which I think is really cool, is the new support for document metadata. I'm realizing now that title sounds pretty boring, but it's actually pretty useful. We can see an example over here. I just have an app that's rendering this blog post component. It's passing in a post, which just has information about the post. It might have a title. I probably should have a body of some kind in here, but this is just a sample anyway. And in this case, it has this keywords prop, which is a comma-separated string. This is pretty much directly from this blog post here. And the blog post component is taking that post object as props, and it's rendering an article and displaying everything that you might want a blog post normally to display. However, one really common thing, especially when you're talking about blogs, is you might want to update the title tag of your HTML document to reflect the title of the post that you're at. This is really common. You'll see it in the tabs at the top of your browser. When you go to a new blog post, it might update what that title is. It's not just a user experience thing, it's actually a really big SEO benefit to have the title tag reflect the content on the page. However, when we're here inside of React, typically we are interacting with the body. Everything that we render inside of React is going to get stuffed inside of this div with the ID of root, and of course that lives in the body, and we don't have direct access to the head of the document, at least until now. Anytime you render a meta tag, a title tag, or a link tag, React will take the content there and it will hoist it up to the head of your document, thus making it a lot easier to modify those tags without using a third-party library, the most popular of which I believe is React Helmet. The blog post does mention that there might still be instances where you want to use a third-party library like that, but for simple things like this, it's really nice for us to be able to just render the title element and have React hoist that up to the head for us. Now, before I started recording, I took a screenshot of the dev tools that shows that, in fact, my awesome blog post is the new value for the title tag, and it's right here inside of the head of the component as opposed to being inside the body. And you can see the other meta tags, and here's the content with test1 and test2, all of which is being hoisted up to the head. And that's pretty much it for support for document metadata. It's pretty straightforward. And that does it for this mini course on what's new in React 19. Now, as I mentioned before, we haven't covered everything. There are a bunch of other additional miscellaneous improvements that have been made to React in React 19. You can click the screenshot here to go to that blog post, which at the time of recording does represent the most updated API that you can find with these new features. As you might have noticed, a lot of these new features don't necessarily affect the core way that React works. And I do have an introductory course on React here on Scrimba that I'm just about to start re-recording from scratch. So I'm excited to jump into that. However, these updates to React 19 actually affect more of the intermediate or advanced side of React. And if any of this felt a little bit over your head, or you just want a chance to dive a little bit deeper into React, you can check out my advanced React course here on Scrimba. My name is Bob Zarol. It's been a pleasure to work through this React 19 information with you. If you want to follow me on X, that's the place that I tend to be most active these days online. And with that, I'm going to set you loose into this new bright world of React 19. Happy coding!